Dear Rotarians, distinguished guests, good evening and welcome to the second edition of our talk series for this Rotary year. The Rotary Club of Phoenix is part of a wider network, which is Rotary International, and we are guided by a set of strategic objectives and areas on which to focus so we can make a positive impact on our community. Over the last 20 years, the Rotary Club of Phoenix has been involved in numerous initiatives. The club has engaged in flagship and sustainable projects like the Thalassemia Ward, screen treatment for children, water project in Rotary, and design and implementation of a sensory garden for the visually impaired. The month of September in Rotary is dedicated to education and literacy. Hence today's vocational talk around financial services, a core part of the Mauritian economy as well. Vocational service is our second avenue of service. No aspect of Rotary is more closely related to each Rotarian than his or her personal commitment to represent one's vocational or occupation. Regardless of the ways that vocational service is expressed, it is the banner by which Rotarians recognize the worthiness of all useful occupations and demonstrate a commitment to high ethical standards in all businesses and professions. That's why the second avenue of service is fundamental to every Rotary club. Without any further delay, I would like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Milan Mitterman. Milan is a member and past president of the Rotary Club of Phoenix. He is a barrister, head Niam Chambers. He has extensive experience of both the public and private sectors at national and international levels. He served as chief executive of the Financial Services Commission and as ambassador of Maurice to the United Nations in New York. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite our moderator, Milan, to come forward to introduce tonight's subject and our panelists. Thank you.
In welcoming you all this evening, I'm going to say a quick word about the objective of this discussion before I call on the panelists to join us on the stage. So, President Akidish just described this talk as a vocational talk, and this is indeed part of the activities of the vocational service of our club. The objective, therefore, of this discussion is primarily what I would call a pedagogical one. That is, we are not going to have a debate on policy issues or the various loopholes or failures of the system or whatever. What we would try to do is basically to enable everyone to understand what is the financial services sector in Mauritius, what are the future prospects of the sector. So I understand that about half of the audience is already engaged in financial services. So I hope that for those who are in this sector already, this will be an opportunity to understand the other segments, because very often we tend to have a sort of silo view of whatever we do, and we don't always relate to the other segments within the sector that we work. So I hope this will be an opportunity for those who are already in the financial services sector to understand the other segments, and for the other half who are not necessarily engaged in the financial services sector, this will be an opportunity for you to have an overview. Now, I want to stress on the term overview because we're going to look at four large sectors of the economy within the hour and a half that we have, and all we can do is just give an overview. But we hope that this will be the first of a series of panel discussions, and that the other sessions will enable us to have a more sort of detailed or focused view at each of the segments within the financial services sector. Okay, so let me, I think we have some slides just by way of introduction. Of course, our panelists will be getting into greater details later on, but just to give you an idea of what we are talking about. So you can see the number of licensees, the employees. There are over 10,000 people working in the financial services sector. The asset under management, though I believe this is only for the global business sector, is 80 billion USD. We then have the contribution to GDP, which is at the moment just over 13%, which is a large sector. It's certainly much higher than some of the traditional sectors of the economy. And then we have some other slides on the stock exchange of Mauritius. You will see that we now have over 200,000 securities which are listed. And the market capitalization, I will leave it to Sunil to tell you what this figure is because I can't read it myself. I think the other slides are also about the stock exchange. Anyway, so I will introduce the panelists, and maybe I should invite you first to join us on stage, and then I can introduce each one of you. So I will start with Daniel Esu, who is the Chief Executive of the Mauritius Bankers Association. This is the industry association for the banking sector in Mauritius. He has more than 20 years experience in the financial services industry in the UK and Mauritius. He currently also serves on the councils of Business Mauritius and of the Mauritius Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the board of the SADC Banking Association, the court of the University of Mauritius, and on a number of consultative councils on financial services. Prior to taking up his role at the MBA, Mr. Esu held senior positions in the financial services industry in London, focusing on the administration of funds and capital market transactions. He started his career with PwC Mauritius and subsequently worked in the global business industry in Mauritius. He holds an MA from Cambridge University. Next is Marie-Annick Pamela Bussier. She is the CEO of Jubilee Insurance Mauritius since June 2018 and is the immediate past president of the Insurers Association of Mauritius. Mrs. Bussier joined the company in June 2018 as Chief Executive Officer. She is a corporate finance executive offering over 28 years of experience building, leading and advising corporations through complex restructuring, international expansion in capital markets. A leader with a track record of documented contributions leading to improved financial performance, heightened productivity, and enhanced internal controls. Pamela is a fellow member of ACCA and holder of an MBA specialized in international business from Coventry University. Sunil Penimadu is the Chief Executive of the Stock Exchange of Mauritius. He has been actively involved in the exchange industry and the financial services sector during the past 30 years. He was a board member of the World Federation of Exchanges between 2014 and 2021. He was president of the African Stock Exchanges Association between 2010 and 2014. He was chairman of Global Finance Mauritius between 2014 and 2020 and is currently a board member of Mauritius Finance. Last but not the least is Shamima Bagam Hassan. Shamima is the Managing Director of Trident Trust Mauritius, a leading corporate fund and trust administrator. She has more than 20 years of experience in financial services with a particular focus on clients operating and investing in Africa. Her career includes leadership positions in international fund and corporate administrators, as well as working for several government agencies, including being Senior Director at the Board of Investment, which is National Investment, was the National Investment Promotion Agency of the Government of Mauritius. And Shamima is the current chairperson of Mauritius Finance, the leading industry association for the financial services sector. So we've got representatives of 4 of the main segments within the financial services industry, and this, as I said, will certainly enable us to have an overview of the sector. So we will start by inviting each of the panelists to give us a brief description of the segment which you represent, a little bit about the history and where you stand in the financial services landscape in Mauritius today. So we'll start with you, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Milan. So good evening, everyone. Daniel Esu, Bankers Association. So if we looked at the composition of our economy, financial services, I think the figures that were there showed above 13%. For a long time, it was about 12% of GDP. Now it's gone up since COVID. And banking, plus leasing, because a large component of leasing is banking, brings it to about 7.7% of GDP. So this is what the banking sector contributes directly to the economy. So I think you'll hear a lot of numbers. Sometimes they are indirect contributions, sometimes they're direct. And so the direct contribution of the banking sector is about 7.5% of GDP. So currently in Mauritius we have 19 banks. And just by way of comparison, in a country like Sweden, you have 4 banks. And they're a richer country than ours, with a larger population. So we have 19 banks operating in Mauritius. And the first bank, I think the oldest bank at the moment, dates back to 1838. So to your question about the sort of genesis of the sector, I think when you think about financial intermediation, Mauritius has been a port in continuous operation since about the 1730s, I guess. And if some of you have visited the Museum of the Bank of Mauritius, an excellent museum, there are coins which have been found in Mauritius. Arab coins, Dutch coins from the Dutch Indian, East Indian Corporation. So that activity of money changing, of ensuring shipments, has been going on for a long time. We were a trade platform, and financial services runs deep in the economic memory of Mauritius. But to speak directly to your question, 1838 is the oldest.
So, good evening, everybody. So, I'm Pamela Bussier, and I'm honored to participate in this discussion. So, I'm representing the insurance sector. And if we look at the sector, we contribute approximately to 1.1% of GDP actually as of 2022. So, we have 8 long-term insurers and 15 general insurers. So it's divided into long-term, which is mainly more life insurance, and we speak of general insurance, it's mainly short-term, that is motor, householders, this kind of risk, medical. So the history of the insurance industry dates back to the 19th century, right? So there was under the colonial rules. So there was mainly insurers who were providing marine insurance at that time. So because Mauritius was a route to Asia, and many, we will say, shipment was done through the island, and these insurers were providing marine insurance. And then in 1855, there was a first insurance company in Mauritius, namely Swan Insurance. And since then, there has been a lot of development in terms of insurance. We will say towards the independence in 1968, we have 5 additional insurers who came in the market. And with the liberalization of the sector in 1980, so there were 4 now insurers joining the, we will say, the Mauritian insurers. So since the sector has continued to expand in Mauritius, offering services and service to the island, but we must say that the insurance penetration is still very, very low in Mauritius. But we are better than African countries, we must say. We are about 2.65% compared to 0%, we will say the 0% compared to the African continent. So this is a bit about the insurance sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Milan. First of all, I would like to thank Rotary Phoenix for inviting me to this panel discussion. So, in terms of genesis, I think it's important to understand when and why the Stock Exchange of Mauritius was set up. So the Stock Exchange of Mauritius, I think you were one of the pioneers, and I saw Shard and India somewhere. I think she's been really also very instrumental in creating the stock exchange. So the stock exchange is relatively young, set up in 1989, and within a very specific context. In the 1980s, Mauritius, as an economy, was going through a major restructuring, because for the previous 200 years, Mauritius had essentially been a sugar-centric economy, deriving almost 25% of its GDP from sugar proceeds, 50% of employment, and 75% of foreign exchange earnings. Then, at the end of the 1970s, we went through a very tough period with the economy crashing and two devaluations, which then led the authorities to rethink about the economic strategy. That's when they went through a major diversification phase of the economy, when they introduced for the first time manufacturing as one of the mainstay of the economy. They also went very full blast in terms of developing the tourism sector, and then the global business came later. So within that context, the authorities in those days, the policymakers, felt that to accompany that restructuring of the economy, it was fundamental to have a modern financial services sector and to move away from what historically had been a bank-centric financial services sector to a more diversified with new players, new blocks, to be developed. So it is within this context that the Stock Exchange of Mauritius was created. It is within this context that the global business sector, which you know very well, was also initiated. It is within this context that, for example, institutions like SIC and others were set up so as to accompany that trajectory of change that Mauritius got into. So, of course, as most institutions, when you were set up, we were set up as a small exchange with only 5 securities listed. I'll show you showing the number of securities right now. And the total market cap, which is the value of the shares of the companies that are listed in those days, were only 1 billion. Just to give you a sense, MCB, which was one of the first stocks to be listed, had a market cap of only 400 million, which means you could have bought MCB in 1989 at 400 million rupees. And that was only about 4% of the country's GDP. So just to give it, because time is of essence, to give a sense of how things have evolved, today we have 200 securities, and the market cap to GDP is currently about 70%, which has come from the 4% to the 70%, and had even at some point in time reached 95%. So there's been a lot of development, but we'll talk about these other things. I just wanted to set the historical background to why the stock exchange was set up. Thank you.
From the one. I think it's good that we mentioned that there was already chambre de courtier, Maurice, depuis le 19e siècle, ce qu'on appelait du 19e siècle, la banque et le secteur de l'assurance. There was something, but it was more in the nature of a private club, I think, with no offense to anyone. But of course, I'm happy to know that today you've got more than 200 securities listed, and that all the skepticism that there was at the beginning was probably not justified.
Yeah, in fact, just to add to what you say, I believe I mentioned have a strong connection from this So I mentioned in my intervention that the GDP of Mauritius in 1989 was 30 billion Mauritian rupees. And you're right, Milan. You even think about creating a stock exchange within a GDP of 30 billion, I think required faith, I would say even belief in the future. So that's why I think all those, like you and I mentioned, Charles and others, Minister I think they were visionaries because you're right. Probably at that point in time, most people were saying, what are we doing now? Why go and create a platform for, modernized platform for trading securities in a small, tiny? It's just like, I'm sure Jean-Claude will talk about that, when the idea of creating global business those days offshore, the World Bank came and said that was a folly, that was madness, because there was no real kind of ecosystem to help that to grow. But we are all today sitting here very happy that those people had the vision, had the drive, and the belief in the country's future. Otherwise, nothing could have happened. So sometimes we need dreamers. We need people who are ahead of the curve, as we say, so as to make things happen. If we don't want to tread on water, we don't want to make anything.
Thank you. So the newcomer, if I can say, the financial services sector, because the others started in the 19th century. This one was only in the late 80s and early 90s, of course, the global business sector. So, Shamima?
So thank you very much, Milan, and good evening, everyone. So, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. So as you said, I represent a little bit the global business sector, and unlike all my predecessors who have spoken about the history, for me, I think where we started is really in the 1990s, where the MOBA was set up at that time, so the Mauritius Offshore Business Activities Act, and that's where this whole concept of offshore started to create and position Mauritius as a platform for cross-border investment. And it happens that at the same time, during that same time, around 1990s, also the economy in India was being liberalized, and we had a very good treaty with India, and that's where the whole activities towards India started for the global business sector. So we started to service and to be a cross-border platform for investment into India, but obviously over time this has evolved, and we are now certainly a platform for investment into Africa. But there has been a journey for us to be where we are. So in 1991 we had the MOBA, but then we had also some other factors that helped into driving the global business is the foreign exchange control, which was liberalized in 1994. So obviously that helped in terms of creating the ecosystem that we required to enable us to grow. We also had then in 2001, where the MOBA Act was repealed and the Financial Services Development Act came into play. And that's where the FSC was also created, and the whole concept of global business entities really started to come up. And that was the starting of the transformation journey to position ourselves as a very stable financial center. So we celebrated last year the 30 years of existence of the financial services sector, And obviously, over time, there's been a lot of addition in terms of the legislation, in terms of products, and in terms of countries that we also service. So we've gone a long way into the global business sector. And if I look at the contribution of global business sector, of the 13%, it's about 7% would probably be of the global business sector. Today we have about 187 management companies that operate in the global business sector. And I will try to elaborate a little bit later on the role of the management company, because we do have a critical role in terms of first line of defense. And you've spoken about the asset, the slide showed about the asset under administration. In terms of global companies that we have in Mauritius, there's over 18,000 today, which comprises between the global business companies and also the authorized companies, and around 950 or so of funds. So that's a bit of, in a nutshell, the ecosystem and the history of the global business sector.
Thank you, Shamima. I'd like to add, just as a matter of historical record, that though the first law on what we used to call the offshore sector was indeed in 1991, but in fact, we laid the foundation of the offshore business in Mauritius before that, because around 1989, there was an amendment to the Banking Act to provide for offshore banking. So, historically, it started with offshore banking, and then the MOBA Act came later. Just to complete this sort of historical, the global picture, we know that in the banking and insurance sectors, we've not had many foreign players. There have been a few. I think at the moment in the banking sector, you probably have one or two. In the insurance sector, I don't know exactly what it is right now. 4 or 5 global players. But obviously, in the as far as the stock exchange is concerned and global business is concerned, there is far more foreign involvement. So maybe you could just say a quick word about this.
So, Milan, I think it's also here to give some perspective to the historical evolution so that we understand why more and more we are moving, at least we want to move towards what we call internationalization. If you look at the history of the stock exchange, which I mentioned started in 1989, between 1989 and 2007 or 2008, we were essentially an equity-centric domestic market catering for domestic companies and essentially for domestic investors. In 1989, the exchange, through change. Yeah. Okay, thank you. So, I forgot what I was saying. We were essentially domestic equity-centric, but then in 1994, Mauritius as a jurisdiction was open to foreign investors. Okay, so that started the process of attracting foreign investors. In those days, I think the Minister of Finance abolished exchange control and so on. These were defining moments in creating the kind of ecosystem that is needed for the emergence of a modern financial services sector. So, but even then we continued until 2007. Then we sat down and started thinking strategically. We said, given the structural limitations of Mauritius as an economy, if we wanted to grow, we had to think about other ways and means to grow and increase the number of securities, deepen and broaden the market. And that's when the first idea that came to our mind is how do we create synergistic links between the local domestic capital markets and the global business, which was already a thriving sector or sub-segment of the economy. So that's when the first thing that we did, we said that if we want to be a multi-asset international exchange, we needed to introduce multi-currency listing, trading and settlement. Otherwise, you can't be. Especially the players in the global business sector, all dollar-based. So that's the first reform and important change that we brought. This was then followed by changes to our rules so as to make them conducive to the requirements of these global business companies that had different requirements from the local companies. So we brought those changes, and there were other changes that we brought, like for example, when we discussed with some issuers of debt instruments, they told us, your rules say that for me to issue a debt on your platform, we would need to have at least 100 holders of this debt. Whereas we are looking for big tickets, but we have already earmarked institutional investors, but we would probably have only 20. So we can't list. So we changed the way we were operating in terms of making the exchange a more service-oriented exchange, listening to the needs of its stakeholders. And one of these key stakeholders are the issuers. So then we introduced rules to cater for what I call specialist debt. That is, those issuers who want to raise capital but are not interested in targeting the retail investors, but only the big ticket institute. So there were a number of changes like this that we brought that explains a bit the number of securities and why many of these securities are non-domestic, either generated by the global business, but we've even gone further. We've listed, for example, ETFs tracking the Indian government bonds. We've introduced ETFs tracking bonds issued by African companies. We've listed Afrexim, for example. There's GRID and so on. So there's been a number of changes, but all this could only happen if we would not have happened had we not been, sensitive to the request and the requirements. So this brings me back to the discussions. When you want to change, when you want to improve a financial services sector, it is always fundamental to have a listening ear to what the market wants. And then to try to, of course, you keep your standards, you keep your requirements, or you don't want to bring in anybody. So your standards, your requirements must be good. But how you structure the rules to meet the needs of the market, I think is fundamental. And that's what we've tried to do. And we also wanted to probably achieve some form of quantum leap when we decided, we said, even that internationalization strategy was a bit limited because it was operating still within the domestic market. So that's when we said, let's leverage on other exchanges and try to internationalize by bringing strategic partners so that we could leverage on their strength and they would leverage on the strength of Mauritius, and we have a meeting of minds where we could grow the pie. But we didn't achieve that, but we still believe that probably we'll get into that discussion. I think that's the future.
So, when we talk of global business, of course, we are talking about cross-border investments and a lot of international players. But in terms of service providers, how many are really global players?
Right. Let me just go back a little bit to when we started the global business, how it started. I think it's good to highlight that when we started the global business, it was due to some visionary entrepreneur who started the business. It's been for a very long time, primarily dominated by Mauritian entrepreneurs who started the business and grown the business. And over time, we've grown into being a reliable service provider with quality of people that we had and trained, and having the availability of accountants and lawyers. But But I think over the last 5, 6, 7 years, we've seen a change in the model and a change in the ownership. So we've seen a lot of acquisition from what we call multinationals and who acquired those companies. And I would say today we are predominantly, there's a large chunk of those multinationals, which probably represent 80%, but we still have quite a good number of management companies, service providers who are still dominated by locals, but which are smaller in size. But the business model as well has changed over time. So I think initially, whilst we were serving companies who were domiciled in Mauritius, funds who were domiciled in Mauritius, I think over time it's now becoming more like a service center to the multinationals' operations. So that's where we see a shift in the model and a shift also in ownership. And it's changed the dynamics, because where we were going is that we're trying to become more focused on value-added service, but we're now becoming more service, I would say, service-oriented and very segmented into what we do. So there's a mix of both, which is happening, but there's also a predominance coming around what we call the global players who are present there today and going for a shift into the model that they operate.
I just wanted to ask a question, because we said it would be a conversation. You mentioned two things here. You said that our intention was to move up the value chain in terms of products and services, but we seem to be moving more towards sort of outsourcing of services, which is lower value add. My question to you is that, are the two not incompatible? So can we still, it's good to have people who are using Mauritius to do outsourcing or whatever, but it's good also to pursue that activity or are you seeing a big shift towards the outsourcing mode, which then becomes a problem?
Thank you very much, Milan. I just wanted to comment back on a point you made earlier in the premise to the question that banks are predominantly Mauritian, and I just wanted to flag that this has changed over the years. So originally you had offshore banks and onshore banks. The offshore banks did FX business, and the local banks did domestic business in rupees, and we're going back to 1989. And then a few things happened. In 2004, there was a single banking license. So up to that point, you had usually branches of international banks set up in Mauritius, and then you had domestic onshore banks just serving the local population. And then from 2004, we started getting more international banks coming in, partly to tap into the international business and the global business. And we also found that the domestic banks were entering into the international business. So actually, if you look at the banking landscape today, 19 banks, actually 12 are what you might call international banks. The majority of banks in Mauritius are actually subsidiaries of international groups. And we have 5 of what you might call indigenous banks that have emerged from local business conglomerates. And of course, 2 of the largest banks are in the domestic space, those local banks, but you also have 2 very large ones in the top 5. You actually have 2 very large international banks. But that's when you talk about the history and shareholding. When you look at balance sheets, it tells a very different story again. What you might think of as a Mauritian bank might be deriving more of its revenue and profitability from outside Mauritius than in Mauritius. So I think that it's good to bear in mind these distinctions when we're talking about the history. But today what we have is lots of banks. The majority of them, 2/3, are actually subsidiaries of international groups. And more than half of the business is conducted outside Mauritius. And I think we have to truly recognize that we are really an international financial center, and that shift over 30, 40 years has really worked its way through our system.
I would like to add for the insurance sector. it's good to know that the second insurer that implemented in Mauritius was New India, with a foreign insurer in 1924. So what I would like to say is that we've seen recently that many global insurers has bought shares in Mauritian domestic insurers companies. So the recent one was Allianz, who is a global insurer, the first insurer globally who bought shares in Jubilee Insurance, 66% of the shares. So, and going forward, there is a merger with Sanlam, who is the biggest insurer in Africa. So we've seen that global insurers are interested to implement in Mauritius, even if we are a very small market compared to what's happening globally in terms of insurance. This is because I think we have a very solid reputation in terms of regulatory framework, in terms of ease of doing business. This has certainly impacted on the fact that these people want to come here. And we've seen in the last budget that the government has, we will say, put on measures for reinsurance companies to be able to come to Mauritius. And we see a lot of them who are starting to implement in Mauritius. So there's two things happening that will be good for the sector. First of all is the competitive advantage. We compete with those who have a very much long history than us. And secondly, I think this will change the dynamic of the sector going forward if all the reinsurers now is at our door. So that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you. Just to complete this sort of overview of the financial services sector, I would like to invite each one of you, maybe just not more than a couple of minutes each, to tell us about the legal and regulatory frameworks. Your regulators, what are the laws that govern your business? Maybe we start with you, Shamima.
So within the global business sector, as I said initially, so we had the Mauritius Offshore Business Act, which was repealed. Then we had the Financial Services Development Act, and then also the Financial Services Act, which came in 2007. And that was really a revamp of, to have a more robust and innovative legislation. So then we had a couple of other legislations that came in, like the Securities Act, and we also have some legislation around more products. So the most recent one is around the variable capital company, which is more around the products, the virtual asset and initial token offering. So these are also legislations that enables you to regulate properly the virtual assets. So it's, for me, I think the legal framework and the regulatory is important, and that's what made the strength of the financial sector. So it's robust, it's innovative, and it's been adaptive. So we keep on changing and adapting our legislation. And there's other legislations like the AML, CFT legislation as well that comes into play. But I think also for Mauritius, it's good to highlight that the fact that on the legal system we have a hybrid legal system has also been a key asset for us in terms of when we were selling the jurisdiction. So from a legal and regulatory framework, I think we really have a robust regulatory framework in place for the global business.
So as a stock exchange, the overarching legislation is the Securities Act, which is an act that governs all licenses that have to deal with securities. And since we as an exchange, we operate a trading platform that deals with securities, therefore we are regulated by the Securities Act, but of course there are other people like asset managers and so on. Anybody that deals with securities or licensed by the FSC and dealing with securities is governed by the Securities Act. And then we, as an exchange, we make also our rules that are then, of course, approved by the FSC. Any rules that we come up with has to be seen and vetted by the FSC and approved. So, for example, we have listing rules And what do listing rules do is they govern the listing of a company. So what is it required for a company to be listed on our platform? But then once it is listed, what are its compliance with the exchange rule, with the listing rules post-listing? For example, in terms of its publication of financial statements, informing the market about meaningful changes that is happening within the company. For example, if a CEO is resigns or is replaced, the company has to inform the market. If there are acquisitions which are important from a, to inform the market about this. So these are the listing rules. And then, because we operate a market where another key stakeholder are brokers, so we have membership rules. A broker is a member of the stock exchange. First of all, to become a broker, you need to apply to the FSC to get a license as a stockbroker based on the requirements of the Securities Act. But then you can have a license, but you may decide not to use that license, but probably the FSC will give you a certain number of months or years maybe to decide to exercise at least the role of that license. Then to become a member of the stock exchange, you need to apply as a licensed stockbroker to become a member, and therefore then you have to comply with our membership rules. So these are two of the main rules that govern our activity, but we ourselves, we are governed by the FSC, which oversees our activities and which regularly come every 2 years, for example, an on-site visit to ensure that we are meeting our objectives, but also we are meeting the requirements of the Securities Act in terms of what a stock exchange needs to do. We are ensuring that we are meeting our responsibilities, our regulatory duties. So
I believe it would be fair to say that of the four sectors represented here this evening, yours has a larger degree of self-regulation.
Yes.
Okay, insurance?
So we are also regulated by the Financial Services Commission since their establishment in 2001. So we are regulated under the Insurance Act 2005, where there has been some changes. Normally, long ago, the long-term sector and the short-term sector was together. Now, with this act, we have to separate the companies. So there is most companies, they have two, that is long-term and short-term, that has been separated. But I must say that in terms of regulation, there has been very strict regulations under AML CFT that was introduced recently for money laundering and terrorism financing, that we had to implement a lot of, we will say, measures in-house. And the FSC has made, every 2 years they make their inspection, and this was very costly, I think, for banks also and us to implement all these regulations. And going forward, we have the implementation of IFRS 17 coming, which is a standard for insurance that we will need to implement in January 2023. And how this affects us is that we will have to change the way our solvency are calculated. So this also is being followed by the FSC. So, and we have the ombudsperson for financial services also that we have to, let's say, to report. So there's a lot of regulations in our sector, but I think this is not a bad thing, because this helps us to improve and also protect the consumer and give us the leeway, let's say, not to do things that can put us in some serious trouble in terms of insurance, because we have a lot of insurance fraud going on all around. Thank you.
Thank you. It's always nerve-wracking to answer a legal question when it's been asked by someone like Dr. Mittalman, considering he's such a fine teacher in law. The banking sector is one of the most regulated, if not the most regulated sector in Mauritius. So it's hard to give a comprehensive answer to that. But the short answer is we have an act called the Banking Act, and you would think that that's the main thing, but it's not. It's the very important one. But banking business is defined as deposit-taking business. So anything that a bank does that is not deposit-taking, a lot of lending, the leasing business, capital markets, corporate finance, is actually regulated by the FSC. So most banks are actually regulated by the Bank of Mauritius and the FSC. But then when you talk about banking, there's two points that I'd like to make. The first point is that there are lots of laws that you wouldn't have thought mattered to the banking sector, which are really important. So all the contracts and everything are actually rooted in contract law, and actually the Code Civil Mauricien, the civil code, not even the Code de Commerce, but the civil code. And that is actually the root of banking practice. We also have some beautiful ancient acts like the Bills of Payment Act and all sorts of other that I won't go into now. The Insolvency Act is a very big one, and in fact I see Mrs. Thakur in that we're talking about reforms to the Insolvency Act, because the taking of surety and realizing collateral in an event of insolvency, the unfortunate end of banking, is actually also very important for us. So there are lots of other laws that directly affect the banking business beyond the Banking Act. And the last point I want to make, again keeping it high level, is that banking is so interconnected that international laws enforced in other countries that affect other currencies, actually have a bearing on the banking business in Mauritius. So if a bank holds a dollar license and there are US rules that place restrictions on what you can do with holding a dollar license, even though Mauritian laws say absolutely nothing about those things, banks are forced to observe certain restrictions. So we often get asked, why don't you do this when there's nothing in the law that stops it? Well, the reality is that banking practice is pervasive and actually extends to Mauritian banks and places extraterritorial limits on what they can do. So those are the 3 points I wanted to make. Banking Act, but also financial services, lots of other laws which you wouldn't think about, and the extraterritoriality of non-Mauritian laws, which combine to make the sector extremely regulated.
Thank you. Maybe just to complete the picture of the regulatory framework, I'd like to say, especially for the benefit of those members of the audience who are not familiar with the financial services sector, that prior to 1989, when the Stock Exchange Commission was set up, the only regulator in the financial services sector was obviously the Bank of Mauritius. We also had an insurance regulator, but that was a department of the Ministry of Finance. So in 1989, therefore, we have a second major independent regulator with the Stock Exchange Commission. And then in 1992, we have MOBA, which is set up as a regulator exclusively for what we then call the offshore sector. In 1997, government appointed a Financial Services Committee, which I chaired, and we recommended the merger of the regulators. So the Department of Insurance, again I stress on the fact that it was only a department, so it was not an independent regulator, MOBA, and the Stock Exchange Commission. So eventually the FSC was set up, and today we have 2 apex regulators in the financial services sector, one for banking and the other one for non-banking. There's always been a long debate, we're not going to get into this tonight, as to whether we should have an integrated regulator or whether we should have these 2 apex regulators. But let me just say that we also have dual regulation, because a bank, for instance, which is conducting a non-banking service will have a license both from the Bank of Mauritius and the Financial Services Commission. Okay, I think we can now move on to the second part of this discussion, which is focus more on the economics. Okay, you've described already your market, who are the players, etc. But maybe you can now give an idea of where you stand in the economy today. We've given some figures earlier about employment, so you could talk about employment, about resources, and generally what is the contribution which each one of your sectors is making to the economy. Yeah, let's start with you.
Thank you. So I think, as I might have unfortunately mentioned in my opening remarks, so the sector contributes, I think, from the figures here, about 7.7% of the economy directly. It employs about 6,000 people. Again, some people are employed by the capital market subsidiaries, which are regulated by the FSC, but as a ballpark figure, about 5,000, between 5,000 and 6,000 people work in the broad banking sector. What's very interesting is the size of banking assets. I think I was looking at 2.3 trillion rupees in terms of assets. Now, for a bank, the assets are loans, and for a bank, the liabilities are the deposits. And it's a bit backwards, just when you think about it, you like to think about assets as what you have in the bank. But these assets are very interesting because the part that's rapidly growing are the international assets, the lending. And maybe I'll talk a little bit about how things evolved, if I may. So originally you had domestic banks with rupee deposits and international banks with FX deposits, hard currencies, that they would lend. When the international business and the offshore business took off, the business model of the international banks was very different. They started off with, where is a good place to book a loan? So if there's the financing of a transaction, a loan to be given to build an airport, for example, somewhere, they would think, which group subsidiary of my bank is the best place to book this loan? And they would book it in Mauritius because we had a good rate of tax, the cost of business was low, and they look at something called the cost to income ratio, and it was a good place to book the loan in Mauritius. So the international banking business was loans driven. It was driven by loans. You book the loan, and then the group will place deposits there to match that, because you always need to match your loans, your assets and liabilities, and keep a balance. So a lot of the international banking business is asset driven, really, with the loans, the deposits to follow. Whereas for the domestic banks that don't have a historic deposit base internationally in currencies, the global business is an absolute lifeline, because then they open deposits for the global business and then they find ways of lending that overseas. So they start with deposits, they have to work to build a deposit base, and then they start learning how to deploy that internationally. So we have these two components in our family of banks in Mauritius. The international banks that don't have a problem finding loans and don't have a problem finding deposits, and they book that, but they depend on the competitiveness of the Mauritian jurisdiction. Whereas for the domestic banks, it's actually a much harder thing. You have to manage your deposit base very carefully and match that and get to know the international landscape, which is why we're finding more and more Mauritian banks teaming up with international partners or doing syndications, club deals, financing another bank overseas that will then lend that on. So I don't know if I've overspent my time, but that was the idea, was to give an overview of business flows and how that's evolved over time.
So I was saying before, we have 8 long-term insurers and 15 general insurers. So the contribution to GDP was 2.1% as of 2022, but we are forecasting to arrive at 4% by the end of this year. I must say that insurance companies, mainly pension funds, they are the largest investors on the market. So they invest a lot, so they carry investable assets. And so it's important that we have the balance between the assets and the premium that we collect. So we invest them so that in future, if there are any claims to be paid, so it's from this fund. So That is why it's been very difficult for us for the past years, because with COVID, the interest environment has gone down. So this has put a lot of pressure on insurance companies to be able to show some, we will say, type of investment risk that we carry. So we have been pressured by that. But fortunately, there has been some changes. And we invest also overseas a lot to be able to keep this balance. We employ nearly 2,600 persons. If I take the brokers, the agents, the insurance professional, there's nearly 3,000 people employed in the sector. And also, we are forecasting that going forward. But we must say that the skills, we have a lot of, we will say, gap in the skills, because people don't wake up and say, oh, I want to work in an insurance company. It's not like that. So we have to attract young professionals, and the association has taken a lot of measures for the education of young professionals to join the sector, because we need people to be able to grow the sector. And this is something that's very difficult for us right now.
When you look at the impact of a stock exchange on an economy, I think there are two types of measures that you would use, what I call the quantitative impact and then the qualitative impact. So I will first focus on the quantitative impact, and generally you would use three types of yardsticks to measure that quantitative impact. So for example, I mentioned you would use how representative the stock exchange is within the ecosystem of the economy in which it is operating. So one key statistic which is used is what's the market cap to the GDP of the country. So the higher the market cap to the GDP of the country is, the more representative of the economy in which it operates this stock exchanges. That's why I mentioned to you initially, when we were set up, our market cap to GDP in 1989 was 4%. And this with a GDP which was only 30 billion, okay, 30 billion rupees. Today we have a GDP which is above 500 billion, and the total market cap of the exchange is about, right now, is about 330 billion. So we've moved to 70%. And I mentioned that at the peak, we even reached 96%. So it's very representative. I would give you examples just for comparison perspective to demonstrate, how representative exchanges are respective to their GDPs. For example, in the rest of Africa, most of the exchanges are around 30 to 40%. Some more, some less, which means that there is still scope for these exchanges to grow. If you take the case of the US, for example, which is a mature market, its market cap to GDP is maybe 300%. Closer to us, South Africa is about 125%. So, which means that these markets have grown to a size where they are outpacing their GDP. Okay, India, for example, 10 years ago was less than 100. I think today it has gone beyond 100. So our objective, of course, is to go beyond 100. And the whole challenge is how do we strategize so as to come above that 100%. And the only way is to internationalize and go more towards outside. So that's one yardstick from a quantitative perspective. A second yardstick is what is the role of the exchange in terms of helping companies to raise capital? Because when companies raise capital, basically that goes into the economy. How? Because many of them would use that money to invest or to create jobs, to invest in technology or whatever. So these new capital that are being raised have a direct impact on how the economy does. So in terms of the statistics, since 1989 until today, about 293 billion rupees have been raised by the companies listed on the stock exchange, be it in terms of equity issues or in terms of debt issues. Now, of course, this number is split between those international / global business companies that are listed, and the domestic, the indigenous, what you call indigenous companies that are operating. And from the statistics that we have, 70 billion have been raised by domestic indigenous companies, and the difference, which is about 220 billion, have been raised by global business companies or international companies like Afrexim and so on. So that's a second yardstick from a quantitative perspective. And then a third yardstick is how much wealth does a stock exchange create for its investors. So the only way to measure that is through what we call indices. Okay, we create index. For example, we have Sendex, which measures the price evolution of all the stocks that have been listed on the stock exchange over time, and this gives you a perspective of how the prices have evolved. And then we've also created what we call a total return index, which includes the price evolution of a stock, but also the dividends that are paid, because companies also pay dividends. And we assume in that total return index that when a company pays a dividend, on the next day, you take that dividend and you reinvest in the shares of the company, which probably most people don't do. But sometimes you can invest. For example, you can tell your broker each time you receive the dividend, reinvest it in the company. But that's the only way to measure what we call a total return index. And if I take the case of the Sendex, which is only price index, since its creation over the last, so we have 1989 to today, 34 years of history, the annualized, which means, of course, because there are years where the market goes up, years where they go down. So if you annualize the return on price of all the companies, which means some companies have done much better than the Sendex, others have done less, but this is an average, a weighted average, it's 9%. And if you factor in the dividends that have been paid, which is the total return index, then the annualized is 14%. So this gives you a perspective of what kind of wealth has been created. Of course, there are some companies that have done much better, others that have done much worse than the index, which is a weighted average reflection of the performance of the stock exchange over a period of time. So that's the quantitative side. But of course, you also have to look at the qualitative impact that a stock exchange has. For example, in terms of reporting, transparency, if you look at, I was looking the other day at the first annual reports that had been published by listed companies in 1989 and compare it to today's annual reports, there is a sea change in terms of information quality, in terms of risk assessment, so there's been a qualitative improvement in terms of how companies are being managed, what kind of governance they have, and all this has an impact, indirect impact on the economy, because the better you govern, the more transparent you are, the more information you give, the better results are, and this has an impact. So that's why I say when you measure the impact, you have to look at the statistics, the quantitative, but also the qualitative. But very often we don't look at the qualitative, which in my view is very important. I mean, governance. Right now, for example, the big debate in the exchange business, as it is in the economy, is about sustainability reporting, ensuring ESG and so on. But all this will definitely have an impact in the way our companies are managed and the new things that they would start engaging in, and how this will change the chart, the way our economy evolves going forward. So these are the things that. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yes. Yes. So it's a good question, and this brings me back to your initial remark, Milan, which I think was very topical in the discussions. You mentioned that before the stock exchange was created, there was the Chambre de Courtiers, okay, which had operated in Mauritius for almost 100 years, or I don't know how long. And it was a club. On shares of companies would be transferred only between the members of the club. So if you look at the large domestic companies in Mauritius today, like MCB, Rogers, or all these large conglomerates, before the stock exchange, they were held only by the members of the club. And probably that was 100 people or 200 people, I don't know. But today, thanks to the vision, and you were part of that vision, I mentioned Sharda also, who has been very instrumental. I think it's important to recognize that, because very often when you talk about an institution, you only know about the people who are running them now. But I think the history is fundamental to understand where we've come from, so that when we think about the future, we can chart things in a better way. So right now, thanks to that vision that those people had, thanks to the faith in the economy, there are 100,000 Mauritians that hold shares in MCB. Well, not only in MCB, but 100,000 Mauritians that were totally out of that kind of thinking, who are today holding shares in MCB, in Rogers, in SBM, and even in some of the international companies. So, yes, democratization has happened. Has it happened to the extent that we would have thought? Probably not, but at least there's been a fundamental change. Otherwise, there were only 200 people or 300 people who could participate in the fortunes of MCB, whose profits go up and whose dividends grow up. So I think it was right. It was the right thing to do, to create a stock exchange and to initiate at least that process of democratization.
So I think if we look at the global business sector contribution, so as I said, it was about 7.2% in terms of the contribution. In terms of employment, it's about 15,000 people that we employ. And it's good also to highlight the resilience of this sector. I think during the time of COVID, this is probably the only sector that has really had a positive growth. So we've survived that period, and it was very resilient. And I think if we look at the whole dynamics of this sector, how it has evolved, I think we've gone a long way in terms of the various activities that we are able to do within the global business sector. Initially, it's been mostly around, having investment holding companies or pooling for funds and global funds. And at the time when we were starting to do mostly the Indian market, it was mostly the private equity and also a bit of open-ended funds. But as we've gone along, we've seen the dynamics into the sector changing, with new products coming in, with new opportunities coming in. So, for example, today we see a lot of opportunities around the debt fund being structured out of Mauritius for investment either into India or Africa. We see, for example, regional headquarters, which has become an interesting product for people that have many offices around, to have their regional headquarters domiciled in Mauritius. Similarly to that, we've seen also activities around treasury management, which has evolved. So companies that have several companies, a presence in different parts of the world, instead of juggling with different currencies, so having all their treasury being managed out of Mauritius, and all that under specific schemes which give them a lot of advantages as well. Family office is another segment that we have seen also emerging, because let's not forget that we are not far from Africa and part of Africa, so there's a lot of wealth. How can we position ourselves, and how can we attract more of the family office to be set up in Mauritius? So over time, I think the activities that have been done under the global business regime has changed and been very diversified. We also see a lot of trading companies now coming to set up in Mauritius. So it's been a lot of evolution around the activities and the products. We've also seen evolution around the market. So I think we look at the recipients in terms of the investment countries. Mostly it's US, Europe. But I think the destination for those investment has also changed over time. So it's not just India. there's a lot of focus around Africa, and there's been some reports that has come out that shows the contribution and the amount of investment that is being channeled through Mauritius for investment into Africa, which represent about 9% of all the FDI flows going into Africa. The amount of jobs that this has created in Africa as well. So there's a lot of contribution that not only directly in Mauritius that we have done in terms of creating our ecosystem, creating employment, but also the impact that this have had in countries where we have invested into through Mauritius. So I think the impact of the global business sector in general has been very significant, large contributor, and today we are the second largest contributor in terms of GDP overall as a sector, so which shows the importance of this sector for the economy.
Sorry, I just wanted to add a couple of points, just as a complement to everything that's been said. The first one, and another point, if I may, Shamima, to add to the global business, is that for the domestic economy, many people often don't think about the importance of the global business sector. But if you look at our balance of payments, there is actually an asymmetry in Mauritius. We run a large current account deficit because we import more than we export. So in theory, you should have a problem. But what really rebalances this is that we run what we call a capital account surplus, so we get more FX. And those FX flows really come through the global business sector. So in fact, one of the things that really help us to stay afloat is the global business sector supporting the domestic economy to maintain the value of the rupee, etc. So this is actually critical in terms of inflation, in terms of the value of the rupee and the stability and financial stability. So this is something that we don't often talk about, but this sector is absolutely critical when it comes to financial stability. The second thing that I wanted to talk about was how interconnected all components of financial services are. So I've talked about how the global business sector provides a large component of the deposit base. I think 30% of FX deposits come from the global business sector. But what also happens is none of this can happen without the insurance sector. So all the professionals in the global business sector have professional indemnity cover, for example. Every home loan that is given comes with a life assurance, which is part of the business of the insurance sector. The financial services sector probably is the area where you get the highest salaries. So the numbers are not necessarily huge. We've talked about 15,000 plus 5, 15, 20,000. But when you look at how much people earn, these are the people who will be investing, who will have a pension plan, which again then gets invested through the stock exchange. So just this little assembly here, the sectors that we represent, has a huge multiplier effect domestically. Not to mention people visiting for board meetings, feeding into tourism, and all of that. So I just thought I'd take a minute or two to just talk about the interconnectedness and the slightly wider implications of the sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, for making this point. As I said at the beginning, I think one of our objectives was, in fact, to enable everyone to understand that there is this sort of link between the various segments. And even if we don't have an integrated regulator, but we have an integrated financial service. We need to leave some time for questions, so we'll move on very quickly to prospects, the future. I have a series of questions, but I'm not going to ask these questions. I'll try to group them together. And I will invite you to talk about your challenges for future development, but also about innovation in the various sectors. But before I do that, I think everyone here would expect us to talk about these big sort of trending issue in financial services, which is the digital economy. Everyone has heard about it, but not everybody knows what this means when we talk of cryptocurrency or digital currency and the digital economy. So can I ask maybe just one of you to briefly tell everybody what we are talking about when we use these terms, these sexy terms which not everyone understands. Maybe Sunil?
Yeah.
Cryptocurrency. So we all know that cryptocurrency originated from, Bitcoin. Basically, what it means is it is a sort of currency. What is the role of a currency? The role of a currency is to ensure that you can use that money to pay, for acquisition of goods and services, etc. And generally, a currency is created by a central bank, and then goes into the banking system, and then goes into the pockets of people, and then starts being used. And generally, the value of a currency, like for example, we take the case of the Mauritian rupee, is linked to some fundamentals of your economy. It's linked to, the inflation differential between Mauritius and, say, the US. It is linked to the rate of interest that you get in savings, because it's a question of demand and supply. In the case of cryptocurrency, everything started when a guy called Satoshi, he came with an idea where he wanted to create a currency of his own, but for his system, which was a computer system, to generate that currency, which initially started as Bitcoin, you had to solve a sort of problem, mathematical problem. So if you manage to solve that problem, then you would automatically get a Bitcoin in terms of, reward for that. So everything started like that, but with the whole idea of moving towards a decentralized monetary kind of system. Okay? So we came with an idea, with a brilliant paper. Until today, we don't know who this guy is, because he wrote that paper very anonymously in 2007 or around that period. But he came up with that idea, and then of course people who are interested in technology, it's digital because you don't see the money, and it's being traded on blockchain technology. Okay, that's the digital part of it. And so people started mining. That's what we call mining, that digital currency. And then the more people started mining, then the idea of this currency could replace other currencies in terms of exchange. So you could use Bitcoin to settle. Let's say if you buy something, you could use Bitcoin. So that's when the interest in the currency started, and the value, which was very low in 2009, when the first Bitcoins were issued and people were trying to sell. Those that had mined those Bitcoins, probably it was less than 1/100th or 1,000th of a dollar. So some people started believing in the future of Bitcoin, and they bought at a very low price. So let's say had you bought 3 Bitcoins or 100 Bitcoins, it would have cost you less than $1. And if you sell those Bitcoins today, it would get you millions or hundreds of millions of dollars. So what really happened was, because the number of Bitcoins that you could create was right from the start limited. So I don't know whether the numbers are known. So the more the Bitcoins were being created, the more difficult the solving the problems became, because you had to use a lot of electricity power and so on, because this is computer generation. So more people started getting, and they were selling Bitcoins in fractions. So that is what has explained. You have thousands and millions of people trading that, but purely speculative. The problem that I personally have vis-a-vis Bitcoin, I like the technology. I think blockchain is the future. But the problem I have is it's a purely speculative play. Of course, I personally myself, as an investor, I've invested in Bitcoin, but purely speculative. I don't believe in the value. Why? Because you can't link it to any fundamentals. Just as I say, the Mauritian rupee has a value because it's linked to the exports, the imports, the economic growth, and so on. The Bitcoin's value is just demand and supply, and how many people are buying and selling, and it has no real underlying value. So that's why people like Warren Buffett, for example, who's a great investor of value, if you read what he has to say on Bitcoin, he says it's madness. Okay, but of course we're living in a world where we need to have all kinds of investors, all kinds of people who decide to. So to tell you, I think the technology of Bitcoin, the digital currency, yes, could be the future. For example, if central banks start creating digital currency and so on, it will definitely add value. And the underlying basis of that digital currency will still be the Bitcoin. So in a certain sense, Bitcoin has added value, but not on its own. So the guy who wrote that paper, I think, has been a tremendous thinker. His thoughts will definitely drive the world. For example, we are talking about tokenization of securities now, to make securities digital. Of course, we've not yet gone a lot in terms of growth in that area, but probably 10 years, 20 years down the road, if you have the same debate, we will see that probably a lot of securities around the world, companies will be issuing digital tokenized securities in the digital way. So I think that's the future. It's going to take more time. So, for example, I get back to blockchain, because right now Bitcoin and so on are being traded through platforms using blockchain. So probably a question which you could have asked me is why exchanges, not only in Mauritius, but I'm talking about the large exchanges, London, New York, and so on, why have they not moved to blockchain technology for trading? There is only one reason. It's because the current state of blockchain technology, it's peer-to-peer trading. It's so slow. So if I go and trade a Bitcoin through a platform, I'm buying and selling from a couple of people. Whereas when you look at trading on an exchange platform, it's a centralized order book where you have orders coming from as many people as that want to trade through our platform. For example, if you take India, I think there are millions of trades happening every day. But Bitcoin is too slow to cater for that kind of activity, that kind of what we call latency in an exchange platform. It's too slow. That's why exchange at this point in time will never go to blockchain technology until there is growth and the latency moves so fast, then probably exchange will move. But probably that's something that maybe concerns us. I think we are living in a world which is changing so fast, and I think artificial intelligence will transform the world in a way that none of us today even think of, and is going at a very fast pace. And I think even in the financial services sector, probably artificial intelligence could resolve that slow use of blockchain technology and then transform the world completely. So probably it would be good to have a discussion on artificial intelligence, because I'm very passionate about that. And I think that's the future. There are lots of risks, but there are lots of opportunities too, and I think the financial services world will get into digitalization.
Daniel, I know you have an academic background, so can you share with the audience your views on fintech and digital economy and so on? Because I think some people in the audience probably have no idea what it is.
Well, it's always hard speaking up to Daniel, because I think he gave most of what anybody would know about this. I think a couple of minor points to add. The term currency is a tricky one, because in law in Mauritius, these are assets and not currency. You can't legally use Bitcoin to buy and sell a service or a good. You have to use a real currency, but you're allowed to invest in it and trade it like you would in art or a car or a watch. It's an asset, so it's a holder of value. But can you use it to exchange as a means of exchange? Nothing prevents barter, really. So you should be able to swap one banana for one Bitcoin if you wanted to, but it wouldn't be currency, legally speaking. But there are developments coming up soon in terms of central bank issued digital currencies. So these are, as Cyril was saying, currencies linked to the value of the rupee. So it's literally a rupee, like the coin you have in your wallet, but in digital format with a technological environment that supports exchanging. So that would mean that issuing currency would not be in the form of phone call to de la rue, it wouldn't be in terms of lending, it would actually be a digital format, and you'd be able to share it around. So I think this is a huge thing that will be coming soon and will transform the way in which we transact with each other.
Thank you. Well, we've already started talking about the future. We've got very little time left. So can I now invite you to just give a quick overview of what is the innovation that we can expect in your respective sectors, and also what are the challenges that you face? We start, Israel.
So we've seen since COVID that there has been a lot of transformation in the sector. So there has been a number of things that have changed. If I'm speaking of insurance covers, we've seen in Albers for cyber security covers, which was not the case, we will say, some years back. And we've also seen an outburst for health insurance and life insurance. People has realized that it was very important to be covered by health policy or life policy in times where our life were in danger. So we've seen this shift from some traditional insurance covering to more specialized lines insurance covering. The second thing is the introduction going forward of the bonus malus system that was not applied to insurance companies in Mauritius, and which has been put in operation by the Financial Services Commission. I think this system will help us educate drivers in Mauritius. So it's very important. If you are a good driver, you get some nice points, nice premium, but if you are a very bad driver, then your insurance premium will go up. So I think this is the second important thing that's going to change the landscape of insurance. And as I already also said, there is the FSC will change the landscape to have reinsurers from abroad to establish in Mauritius. So we will change the game of reinsurance in Mauritius. I will say that from a very small, we will say, marine insurer back in the 19th, we've grown to a very big and we will say solid financial system, and with the contribution of everybody. So what I expect for the future, continue to develop. We were speaking about artificial intelligence. We just put online an artificial intelligence for us. That is, you take a photo of your car, you upload it on the website, and the AI will respond with a quotation. So there are things like this which will help us, we will say, solidify the sector and help us to grow, because there's a lot of margin to grow. The penetration is very small in Mauritius, so there is a lot of margin, there's a lot of niche market that we can go in to develop further the sector and give the best service. For us, it's service and service.
Thank you. So for banking, I think the biggest thing that will affect everyone is digitalization. The fact that today a bank, when we think about it, is a branch, a building, people, whereas more and more banks are just this. There are 100% digital banks. You can open an account and apply for a loan in a few minutes or seconds. Somebody's telling me that in 7 seconds you could get a loan. So how does this really transform regulation? How does this transform how a bank operates? The processes internally, it's a big computer. And how do you set parameters? How do you staff this? These are huge challenges, and how does the regulation follow that? How do you open an account entirely digitally without taking a piece of paper to somebody? These are things that are coming up. From an international perspective, we're talking about payments, cross-border payments. Today you have to go through the SWIFT channels, takes a few days to clear. the technology now allows instant cross-border payments. So how do we get to that point? How do we develop the wealth management segment? That's quite a big one for banks. I think there's a huge opportunity there with all that we have in terms of asset management, the exchange, the trust products. How do we build an offer for the region? And of course, how do we keep on supporting the Asian markets, which we've supported and we've serviced for many decades? And with the rise of the African continent, the huge growth story of the next decade or two, how do we position ourselves to capture that? So these are the big topics that people talk about at the moment. And probably also the increase in fraud. How do we combat financial criminality? It's a very large topic. So in a nutshell, what we're working on at the moment. Thank you.
Well, we've talked about banking and insurance, and there's a global trend towards what is known as bancassurance. Do you see this happening in Mauritius? Or is it happening already? No?
Yes, I think bancassurance exists a very long time ago, but we've seen effectively that the cooperation with banks and insurances is growing slowly, but slowly. I think we try to help banks in giving covers in terms of mainly loans, or if you buy a car at the leasing company with banks. So these are the two main and life insurance covers that we give. So these are mainly the three main pillars, among others, where there has been a cooperation between banks and insurance. And I think this sector, if we compare to Africa, is small for us. But if you look at Africa, it's huge in other African countries. But however, I think we have room for development again for this sector. Cooperation, we say.
Yeah, I think for us, if I take the challenge first that we are facing at the moment is human capital. And one of the things that we feel could address the shortage of human capital is certainly technology. So by automating a lot of our processes, but also what we've seen in some of larger groups also is robotization. So all the mundane and repetitive tasks which are being conducted by robots. So at the moment, human capital is a big challenge for us, and we need to address that. The second thing that we see in terms of challenge is the compliance. I think compliance level in Mauritius has significantly increased, and with that entails the cost. And when you talk to clients, so clients always complain, why do I have to pay for that? This was not like this previously. So there's a lot of education to be done to the clients around the compliance level that we have reached and why we should maintain a certain level of compliance. And I think the third aspect will be about the competitiveness. So we are no longer the only beautiful girl in town. So previously people were coming automatically to Mauritius when they were looking to certain jurisdictions, but today they have the choice. They look at the different options. So we need to be mindful of that as well, so to remain competitive and not have too much of operational costs, compliance costs adding to the jurisdictions. In terms of opportunities, I think there's quite a number of products that we can certainly continue to look at and go into more deeper. I think one of the opportunities that we see at the moment is certainly around all these digital assets and probably with the framework that now has, with the app that we now have around Vitos, this will help to attract more of those kind of products. Other products that we see interesting is around the debt instrument, and if we look at the debt market compared to equity market, it's significantly higher and growing both in Africa and in Asia. So if we can capitalize on that, I think that would open a lot of doors and opportunities for more business. Family wealth management, I think Daniel mentioned about it. There is a lot of synergies that can be developed between the structures that are put here and the banking facilities that can be given, but also attracting those people to do more in Mauritius, so be it in terms of property, living and residing in Mauritius. So I think these are, for me, where we see. And the next thing that we see is ESG, so sustainable investment. I think that's something which is becoming big. So we need a framework for that, and I know the ministry and the regulator are working towards that. But certainly that's where we see the next level of growth coming in. So even among our clients, most of the forthcoming funds and forthcoming opportunities are around climate, around sustainable. So if we don't have the proper framework to enable them to do that in Mauritius, it will be difficult, and we'll probably lose opportunities. So I think for me, in a nutshell, these are the challenges and opportunities for the sector.
Thank you. In terms of challenges, we have what we call the immediate challenges, like, the current macro environment where, the rupee has been depreciating at a very fast rate. So, of course, this has an impact on investments. And then we are, as the rest of the world, we are evolving in a high interest rate environment. And we all know the inverse relationship between valuation of financial assets and increased interest rates. So this has definitely had an impact, but those are immediate and conjoncturel, as we say in French, and hopefully things would start improving, and we're already seeing the rupee stabilizing and even appreciating against the euro and the GBP and against the dollar, so this is a good sign from a pure investment perspective. And then in terms of opportunities, I think when you look at the historical valuation of companies on the stock exchange, our historical price earnings ratio of the market in general has been above around 12 historically. Today, I think it's below 7. And when you look at the earnings of the companies that are being released, I think there's great value right now, especially if the rupee stabilizes. So these are the opportunities right now. But then in terms of opportunities going forward, I think we need to tackle the issue of the structural limitations of a small market. So the way forward is internationalization. And there's one thing which has always been quite close to our hearts and which I would like to throw in terms of thought process is how do we enhance that synergistic links between the global business sector and the capital markets in Mauritius so that we position Mauritius as a capital raising investment banking hub for Mauritius going forward, especially towards the African companies. But for this to happen, I think it is important also to start thinking about positioning the global business sector not only as a fund jurisdiction for investments, let's say into India and so on, but also as a funds jurisdiction to finance IPOs, for example, of SMEs in Africa or even large-sized companies. So if we manage to do that, if we manage to really create that ecosystem, I think this is going to be a game changer for Mauritius, because then we would be able to sell Mauritius as an investment banking, capital raising, and it will also help to move up the value chain. I think the reason why I asked Shamima this question, I'm a bit concerned that when the global business sector was set up, it was set up with an objective, and as you mentioned, we've done tremendously well because this has changed the landscape, it has created a lot of wealth, and it has contributed a lot to the GDP. But now you seem to say that we are shifting, but it's not a bad thing to move towards outsourcing of services or whatever. But if this becomes the mainstay of the global business sector, then it starts creating problems. So, absolutely. I think that's why I asked this question. Yes. Yeah, probably. They are shifting the businesses that are more competitive to do in Mauritius, but that's not necessarily the high value one, which is good because it's employing people and so on and so forth. But I think when we strategize, it is important that we we try to see how to really leverage, because this is the future. As I mentioned, if we don't internationalize it across, be it the banking sector, be it the insurance sector, be it the global business or the stock exchange and capital markets, we'll never get to that level, and that's the whole challenge. It's not easy because, as you mentioned, a lot of jurisdictions are trying to do what we do, but then we will need to sit down and put our heads, and my concern is we are losing people. And in this business, it's human resource that is the most important ingredient. And I still believe that there is a lot of potential that probably we need to tap into. I think South Africa, we need to be able to attract business from South Africa because they are in a terrible mess right now, be it on the economic, be it on the political and so on. And many of the, if you look at the data, South Africans are leaving the country in big numbers. So this is the opportunity for Mauritius, but then we need to have a very focused strategy in terms of reaching out on an individual basis to the key institutions that we want to bring here and get them to tell us, so what is it that they want that we need to offer them so that they can come and do business here. They would come with higher value add services and they would make a difference to our financial services sector. So for me, that's the future.
There was an article in Express this morning saying that there are lots of Mauritians also leaving the country, so it's not only the South Africans leaving. Anyway, I think we will have to, we are running out of time. So we'll take a few questions from the audience. If you could please introduce yourself and ask the question. And as far as possible, we'll